It's 1997, Steve Austin's running his mouth, the undercard's full of gimmicks that nobody cares about, and Vince McMahon is about to hit the panic button. The WWF is still a train wreck, but for once it feels like a train that might actually be heading somewhere good. The Royal Rumble drew a massive crowd of 60,000 fans in San Antonio, but a lot of the tickets were given away for free. The fans were pretty quiet for the most part, and the card didn't exactly help. Goldust vs Triple H and Ahmed Johnson vs Farouk fell flat, and the Lucha match got the coldest reaction of all. They brought in Mexican talent to appeal to local fans in Texas, but nobody seemed to know who they were. The Rumble match itself was a letdown for the 5th year in a row. It was slow and it was lacking in star power. The final stretch featured Austin, Bret, The Undertaker and Vader, and somehow fake Diesel was still hanging around. Austin was the one standout as he eliminated 10 men before getting thrown out by Bret, but in classic fashion he raised hell by sliding back in, throwing out Bret and winning the damn thing. It turned out that the referee had missed him being eliminated, and so he was declared the winner. Screwy finishes like this would become far more frequent as the company found its new attitude. In the main event, Shawn beat Sid for the WWF title in front of his hometown crowd, but the crowd reaction was surprisingly mixed, and his reign as champion barely lasted 3 weeks. On Raw, he limped down to the ring and claimed that he had a knee injury and was emotionally burned out. He said that he'd lost his smile and he was forfeiting the title. The whole segment was pathetic and came across as melodramatic and insincere. 1997 was the year that Michaels hit his peak of being a total prick backstage, and now it was bleeding over onto the screen. He was supposed to face Bret at WrestleMania, but now that was off the table. Bret believed that Shawn dropped the title to avoid having to lose to him, which was incredibly selfish if it was true, at a time when the company needed all of its top stars on hand. Thanks to HBK, they had no champion and no WrestleMania main event, just a month away from the show. In Your House Final 4 was a forgettable pay-per-view, even with Triple H vs The Rock on the undercard and the debut of China, but the main event more than delivered. It was intense and bloody, and unlike anything the WWF had ever done before. This was revolutionary after years of dull, new generation title matches. Bret ended up winning the belt at the end of this incredible fight, and then he lost it the very next night to Sid. These fast throwaway title changes became an Attitude Era trademark and one of its worst habits. WrestleMania 13 is remembered for one thing: the Hitman versus Stone Cold. It was a brutal submission match that saw Austin pass out in a pool of blood and Bret finally turning heel. It was the best match of the year, and nothing else at WrestleMania got anywhere near it. The main event saw The Undertaker beating Sid in a pretty bad match, and the title changed hands yet again, with the Dead Man walking out as the champion. In March, Raw hit a low point. It was a taped show from Germany, and it looked incredibly low grade. It actually looked dark and dingy on the screen. The rating for the show was a 1.9, while Nitro scored a 3.4. That means that nearly 1.5 million more homes were watching Nitro than Raw that night. This was a wake-up call for Vince. It was clear at this point that WCW was going to engulf them, and so he finally started making serious changes. Raw got a full makeover, a giant stage, huge pyro every week, a new theme and a new name, Raw is War, which was pure marketing genius. But it came from a place of desperation. Vince later admitted that the company was in serious financial trouble. Another sign of Vince's desperation was the ECW invasion. The WWF had been losing to WCW for months, mostly due to the success of the NWO. Vince recognised that the WWF needed to be more unpredictable, and ECW seemed like the perfect partner thanks to their reputation for chaos. ECW invaded Raw in February, but they did a terrible job of explaining who they were. Casual fans were baffled because they didn't know anything about ECW, and backstage things weren't going much better. The WWF talent resented losing their airtime to a bunch of outsiders, and RVD ended up walking out over how ECW was being treated. The angle fizzled out with no payoff, leaving the fans even more confused. Reportedly, Vince even loaned ECW $1 million to help them stay afloat, which is a surprising amount for a man whose own company was allegedly about to go out of business. The ECW crossover proved that Vince knew that the WWF had to get edgier if it wanted to compete, but he hadn't yet worked out how to pull it off. And by July, it was clear that he'd been watching WCW because suddenly the Federation had a gang problem. In another attempt to copy the NWO, the WWF was flooded with factions. Groups like Los Boricuas, DOA and the Nation of Domination were deeply uncool compared to Hogan's band of thugs over on the other channel. One group that was entertaining was D-Generation X. They were funny and rebellious, but it also gave Shawn an outlet to bring his real-life bad attitude onto television. Shawn was back on the roster just 6 weeks after losing his smile, and he was right back to pissing everyone off, including Bret. By mid-1997, the real-life tension between Bret and Shawn was spilling onto TV. In May, Shawn cut a promo implying Bret had been sleeping with Sonny, which led to a backstage fight where Bret took Shawn down and ripped out a clump of his hair. After that incident, Shawn told Vince that he didn't feel safe and handed in his resignation like a total diva. Of course, it didn't stick, and he was back on TV a few weeks later like nothing had happened. After all this drama with Shawn, Bret's family and friends rallied around him backstage, and that started showing itself on TV too. The Hart Foundation reformed, and the Canada vs USA feud became the best storyline of the entire year. Bret was a villain in the United States, but a hero in Canada and the rest of the world. It was one of the smartest storylines they'd done in years, but it stood in stark contrast to the rest of the show, where there was still a lot of problems. At SummerSlam, Legion of Doom faced the Godwins, and yes, it was as boring as it sounds. The Godwins pig farmer gimmick dated back to the 1995 era, where every mid-carder had a day job. Most of those gimmicks were gone by this point, thank God, but somehow these two were still getting a push. They weren't entertaining, and they certainly weren't over with the fans. LOD had been back in the WWF for about 6 months, and when they first came back they got a big pop from the crowd, but it didn't take long for the novelty to wear off. With no direction, they got stuck in an endless loop of matches that no one cared about. But they weren't even the worst thing on the SummerSlam card. That honour went to Goldust versus Brian Pillman. On paper, two of the WWF's most unhinged characters should have worked, but it was a mess. The stipulation was, if Pillman lost, he had to wear a dress on TV for the next few weeks. This was Vince's idea of trying to make the product more edgy, but it probably caused more viewers to turn off than anything else. But the real story was the slow death of the Goldust character. When he debuted in 1995, he was provocative and unsettling, but now they were starting to run out of ideas for him, and by the end of the year, he was wearing bondage gear and being led to the ring on a leash. What began as one of the decade's most interesting gimmicks became a total embarrassment. In September, the WWF ran a UK exclusive pay-per-view called One Night Only, headlined by the British Bulldog versus Shawn Michaels for the European title. It was a homecoming for Davey Boy, who was very proud to have his sister Tracy sat at ringside. She was battling cancer at the time, and the match was dedicated to her. The original plan was for Davey to beat Shawn and retain the title, but Shawn had other ideas. He used his influence to change the finish, so he was the winner. Davey Boy was married to Bret's sister Diane, and it's likely that he got the finish of the match changed just to piss Bret off. After the match, the UK fans pelted the ring with trash and shouted expletives at Shawn as he went back up the ramp. Backstage, Davey was reportedly devastated, and his sister Tracy was in tears. She passed away just 14 months later. Around this time, Vince told Bret that he was running out of money and he couldn't afford his contract, and he advised him to sign with WCW instead. On the day of the Bad Blood pay-per-view in October, Brian Pillman was found dead in his hotel room. He was just 35 years old, and the cause was later revealed to be an undiagnosed heart condition. The pay-per-view went ahead as planned, and the next night on Raw, Vince interviewed Brian's wife Melanie live on air. She was clearly uncomfortable as Vince kept on pushing drug-related questions. This was before the toxicology report came back and proved that his death had nothing to do with drugs, so this was a massive, incorrect assumption on his part. The segment was tasteless and pointless, but it showed Vince's desperation for ratings. One of 1997's big successes was the debut of Hell in a Cell. The match featured Kane's unforgettable debut, and Glenn Jacobs must have been thrilled to finally have a gimmick that actually worked. But for all of its brilliance, the match still didn't have a clean finish. Kane's interference handed Michaels the win, so he escaped without doing a clean job yet again. Screwy pay-per-view endings like this were about to become much more common in this new version of the WWF. Speaking of screwy finishes, Bret faced Shawn in the Survivor Series main event in Montreal. Bret was the champion, but he was on his way out to WCW. Vince had promised him that he could leave on his own terms, and he did have reasonable creative control in his contract too. But with WCW dominating, he was scared that Bret was going to show up on Nitro with his title. And so, when Shawn locked Bret in the sharpshooter, Vince called for the bell despite him not tapping out, and Triple H claimed that they had no idea that this was going to happen, which later proved to be a total lie. Bret punched Vince in the face, giving him a black eye, and the Hitman wasn't seen again in the company for 12 years. The next week on Raw, Vince appeared in an interview. His only message was that Bret screwed Bret. And just like that, the Mr. McMahon character was inadvertently born, the villain that would define the next few years. It was the clearest sign yet that the old WWF was gone, and now anything was fair game. In Your House D-Generation X was the year's final pay-per-view, and it was trash. The main event saw Shawn defending the title against Ken Shamrock, and once again it ended in disqualification. After 12 months of betrayal and exploitation, there was no denying it. The Attitude Era had officially begun.